to that. And Rick, over to you. Please, would you introduce John?
Thank you very much, Jeff. Yes, it's a great pleasure to introduce John. I should thank Peter Riley, in fact, for asking me to do so. John and wife Hilary are our very best friends with my wife Jill. John's currently a Emeritus Professor of Quantitative Ecology and Paleoecology in Bergen. He's been there since 1984. Before that, he was at the Botany School in Cambridge University, and he's a fellow of Sydney Sussex College. Perhaps sparing his blushes, but I would say he's probably the world's most famous paleoecologist, specializing in pollen analysis and the use of pollen analysis in reconstructing vegetation history on a range of timescales, post-glacial timescales and more recently interglacial timescales. And he's especially pioneered the use of multivariate statistical techniques in the analysis of paleoecology data. And his research, he's been recognized by awards many countries, has an honorary doctorate from the University of London, Sweden, and is also a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And he's an honorary fellow of UCL, which is my own university. First met John in 1972. I just realized that that's 50 years ago in Cambridge, when John was organizing an international conference on paleoecology. But we didn't work together until the 1980s, and that was when he, I and a Swedish colleague, Ingemar Rehnberg, we coordinated a large multinational project called SWAP, designed to bring together research groups in Norway, Sweden, and the UK to solve, as it was called, the acid rain problem once and for all. But that's a story for another day. Since then, our two research groups in London and Bergen have worked together almost continuously. And of course, that's required John to visit London frequently and usually with Hilary as well. And we've always looked forward to those visits because it's not just been about science, it's also been about visits to early music concerts, especially concerts by the Academy of Ancient Music, and visits to Chinese restaurants and to a famous fish and chip shop in London as well. John's other major botanical interest is in alpine flowers. He and Hilary have visited probably almost every mountain region in the world, many mountain regions, perhaps several times. The only continent I think he hasn't been to a mountain region in is Antarctica, and perhaps getting just a little bit too late to explore Antarctica, but perhaps not too many alpine flowers there either. But tonight he's talking to us not about alpine flowers globally, but about mountain plants in Britain. British mountain plants, history, status and future. So over to you, John.
Sorry about that. Just say my appreciation for being invited to talk to you all about British mountain plants, because as you'll see in a minute or two, that although I was a schoolboy in Manchester, my first encounter, my first adventure looking for mountain plants was in April 1963 in Yorkshire. So what I shall do is besides a short introduction, is try to answer the impossible question, what are mountain plants? Then tell you a little bit about the history of them, the current status of mountain plants in Britain, and because of time constraints, that is, Britain here is only going to be Northern England, the Lake District, and North Wales. There's just not time to cover Scotland or Ireland. Then something about the future of mountain plants and some final conclusions. Well, as a schoolboy in Manchester, I was interested in botany and also in mountains. And I started doing what's called pollen analysis, looking for fossil pollen in bogs and mires in Lancashire and Cheshire. I was unbelievably excited when I found pollen of Jacob's ladder, Polymonium ceruleum, and the purple saxifrage, Saxifraga opustifolia, in late glacial sediments in lowland Cheshire. And yet, as a boy, I was completely mystified. Here, their nearest living colonies were in Derbyshire for Jacob's ladder, or the Craven Pennines for Jacob's ladder, and the purple saxifrage. And also in North Wales, there's purple saxifrage. So in 1963, April 1963, I visited Pen-y-Ghent in April and Malham Cove in August. And then subsequently, when I was a student, I was employed by the Nature Conservancy to do a survey of the limestone pavement in the Craven. So very quickly, my first real encounters with mountain plants was in the Craven and Pen-y-Ghent, and up these wonderful east-facing Yoredale limestone cliffs with some spectacular scenery. And on those cliffs, you can find in April, in spring, the wonderful purple saxifrage, Saxifraga opustifolia. And then in the summer of 63, I visited Malham Cove, and on the steep grassy slopes below, you can see Jacob's ladder, Polymonium ceruleum. So what on earth were Jacob's ladder and purple saxifrage doing in Cheshire 12,500 years ago? So we'll come on to answer that question in a minute, but we have to face this thorny problem: what are mountain plants? Well, the obvious answer is plants that grow in the mountains. But of course, how do we define a mountain? Now in Britain, this is usually areas above about 600 meters, about 2,000 feet. So mountain plants are generally thought of as plants that today have their main occurrences above the presumed elevational tree line, i.e. those are strict alpine, or beyond the latitudinal tree line, strictly Arctic. And so the posh name for them is really Arctic alpines. And in Britain, the presumed tree line was between about 500 and 800 meters in the so-called mid-postglacial or Holocene. Now in Britain, there are about 150 such mountain ferns and flowering, and many of them are very rare, local, and are not at all prominent and important in mountain vegetation. And the main species in mountain vegetation are common grasses, sedges, rushes, heathers, dwarf shrubs, and a few ferns. So that leads us to, why should I get excited by finding pollen of purple saxifrage and Jacob's ladder in Cheshire? It was a great surprise to me. It was also very, very exciting. So this leads us to, how do we reconstruct past flora and vegetation, and what can we discover about the history of mountain plants? Well, obviously we rely on fossils, and they can be of three types: pollen, i.e. small pollen, small fossils; macrofossils that we can see with our naked eye, like seeds, fruits, and leaves; and then most recently, fossil DNA can be extracted from sediments, and this is becoming increasingly sophisticated and is getting more and more refined. So if we look at what sort of things we see down the microscope, here are some common late glacial pollen grains: birch, willow, heathers. And then you find lots of grasses, sedge, and Artemisia, the mugwort. And then, so those are the big common things. And then you get really excited, or at least I do, right, when you find pollen of knotweeds or the maritime thrift, daisies, dandelions, the great polymonium, and these wonderful pollen grains of pit pinks and ghostfoots and cabbages. Macrofossils, which my wife is a world expert on, are things like seeds, fruits, leaves, twigs, and they can be often identified to a lower taxonomic level than pollen. Pollen is often only to family or genus, whereas macrofossils can often be to species level. And they can be well preserved where there's a lack of oxygen, such as in lakes, glacial rivers, permafrost. And being relatively heavy and usually not transported very far from their place of origin. And they thus give us a very good idea of the plants that we're actually growing locally. So these are the sorts of things that Hilary finds: grasses, there's pollen of betula, and here's, sorry, whoops. And these are the fruits of dwarf birch, which you'll see pictures of later, and the tree birch, Betula pubescens. And you can't really satisfactorily separate them on the basis of their pollen. You need the macrofossils. And sedges, one pollen type, but all these possible macrofossils. And then you'll also find leaves of willows, the dwarf willow, Salix herbacea, and Salix polaris, the polar willow, which is a plant that doesn't grow in Britain today, but used to during the 12, 13,000 years ago. And also the Arctic willow, which again is not a British plant. Now you find these remains, pollen, spores, fruits, and so on, in a range of sedimentary environments, but wherever there's an accumulation of material and a lack of aerobic oxidizing conditions, such as lakes, river channels, and so on. So there's a very typical lake, the mountains, Jotunheimen, Van Eycken. And then these, to get the sediments out of these lakes, you either rely on the lake surface to freeze, or in our sort of climate, you have to use rubber, make a raft, go out into the middle, find the deepest part, and then using coring equipment. There's a former student of Brit Batterby's, Gavin Simpson, and here are another two, Nigel Cameron and Viv Jones. And then you basically push further and further down, and then you get a sediment core. And this is one such sediment core, late glacial clays, early post-glacial organic sediments, or this is with a different type of core. You can also find them in, for example, this is an old gravel pit, or along situations like these braided rivers in Alaska, or in these types of streams, stream banks on Spitzberg. The most spectacular, of course, is when in permafrost, you find animal remains such as mammoths, which have been discovered, preserved in Siberian permafrost, and also then their dung, and it gives you an idea of the diet, flora from the pollen, the macrofossils, and so on. And Hilary's also worked on animal dung. Well, the early pioneers were, in fact, in Scandinavia. Swede, Alfred Nathorst, found the remains of Arctic plants in the clay layers under a bog in southern Sweden. And similarly, then next year, the Dane, Japitus Stenstrup, found similar Arctic layers in Denmark. And they called it Drias time, after the mountain avens, Drias octopetalum. And these are some of the leaves that they found about 12,000 years ago in sites in Denmark and southern Sweden. And so now there have been many, many studies. And so in these maps, the shaded areas like that is the present day distribution, and this is of the dwarf willow, Salix herbacea, and in the red area is where fossils have been found. So you can see that the dwarf willow was once in Denmark, in the Netherlands, even in southeast England. Mountain avens, Dryas octopetala. Again, you see it was once much more widespread than its present-day mountain distributions in Scandinavia, the Alps, and British mountains. And it probably spread both in and out of this area. Dwarf birch, the Bechulanana. Again, you see once a much more widespread distribution than it has today. And besides those plants which still occur in Britain, we then find in the late glacial and glacial plants which don't have English names because they're not in Britain, but these you now find today in northern Scandinavia mainly, or the places like Spitsbergen, where that photograph and that photograph were taken. You will find some remarkable plants in that the Iceland purslane, this minute little member in the dock family, only occurs in Britain on the Isle of Skye and the Isle of Mull, and yet its pollen grains, which are very distinct, have been found many places in Britain and in Scandinavia, but most surprisingly in Central Europe. And it doesn't grow in the Alps or the Pyrenees today. And I can assure you, have been rather keen on this silly little plant, that I have looked for it quite hard in the Alps, and like many other people, never found it. So it's a case of a plant which never was in Central Europe, but then retreated northwards. So coming back to my Jacob's ladder, and that's my fossil records of it here, the present day distribution is shown in blue. So it's in Derbyshire, the Craven Pennines, and a single locality, Northumberland. And yet it was quite widespread once in Britain, also just into Eastern Ireland, and one locality in Scotland. So what happened to these plants that were once more widespread in Britain when the post-glacial climate started to change? Well, they found refugia above or beyond the tree line, or in areas where the forest couldn't develop, such on steep limestone slopes, for example, at Malham Cove. And so these are the sorts of places, limestone cliffs in Inchnadamp, West Sutherland, or Cronkley Fell in Teesdale on limestone, or unstable areas along the Tees, limestone in the Burren, sea cliffs on Skye, Craven Pennines, or Dryas Heath down in Scotland, northwest Scotland. And we'll return to some of these places in a minute. Bucover Scar, for example, in Yorkshire, Falcon Flints in Teesdale, and so on. So basically, these plants were forced into these naturally open habitats. And we now know that at least 11 Arctic alpines went extinct in Britain at the end of the last glacial period, about 11,600. 10 were once more widespread, but are now very rare, like Jacob's ladder, confined to just a few areas. So you see they've had a long and fascinating, complex history. Now, what's the current status of them? Well, there are about 150 mountain plants in Britain, 60 of which are confined to the Scottish Highlands. And as I said, I'm only going to consider Northern England and North Wales. So we'll start in the Craven Pennines, then we'll move to Upper Teesdale, the Northern Pennines, Cheviot. Then we'll go to the Lake District and finally North Wales. And in those areas, there are about 90 mountains. And all the pictures that I'll show you are taken in Britain unless stated otherwise, and they're all scanned in from my old Kodachrome 25 or 64 slides taken between 1963 and 1992. So let's start in the Craven Pennines. you know them better than I do, but we've got here Ingleborough, and the basal rock here is the Great Scar limestone, often it's pavement, such as here at Scar Close, overlain by Yoredale limestone and capped by millstone grit. And in the limestone pavement, which I spent a very happy summer in 1964 surveying for the Nature Conservancy, you get the most wonderful range of beautiful plants. The bloody cranesbill, the wood melic, and then wonderful show of ferns, the limestone fern, the wonderful holly fern, Holisticum bronchitis, the rigid buckler fern. I was surveying, it was called Bryopsis filarii, it's now called Bryopsis submontana. In the crevices, little green splingwort, and then trailing across on the surface often stone bramble, Rubus saxatilis. Now, if we start our gentle ascent from Scar Close up onto Ingleborough, then we start to find mountain plants. Alpine bistort and the mountain pansy, which can be in either a yellow or a purple form. You also find other violets. And I, in 1964, thought I'd found lots of Viola riviana, the common dog violet. And in the last 20 years, Jeremy Roberts, a very super botanist, discovered, in fact, that myself and almost everybody else misidentified the common dog violet on Ingleborough, in Ghent, elsewhere in the Craven, and it actually turns out to be Viola rupestris, the Teesdale violet. But you have to be a rather specialist to be able to tell them apart. And I'm in very good company. A number of botanists have been up Ingleborough and misidentified the plant. When you get to the Yoredale limestone cliffs, the east, or they're either east or west facing, and the east are the ones which are generally richer. And on there you'll find things like the mossy saxifrage, the very attractive alpine cinquefoil, open to the Cransii. In crevices, slightly shaded, the roseroot, Rhodiola rosea. And although I've not seen it on Ingleborough, but good friend Eric Ratcliffe found it, the alpine sawwort, which is a plant really of the highlands, Sausuria alpina. But of course, to me, still, the prize of the Craven Pennine on here the east side of Pennygen is the purple saxifrage. And this is actually a patch, a photograph taken in Norway, but it's the best patch I've ever seen of this beautiful plant. It really is, to me, still the prize of the Craven Pennines. On the summit areas, here we're looking at the summit plateau of Ingleborough from Simon Fell. You will find a few, and there are very few nowadays, dwarf willow, Salix herbacea. And on the summit there is a lady's mantle, Alchemilla minima, which is endemic. The only place it's known is here on Ingleborough. And in the surroundings of Ingleborough and Pennyghent, as you all know, you'll find limestone caves, potholes, sinkholes, and old lead mines and waste. And on the lead mine waste, you often find the spring sandwort, Sabulina, used to be called Minuartia verna, and alpine pennycress, now called Ochachia syrenescens. It's much easier to say. When I was a schoolboy, it was Slaspia alpestri. And at Allen Pot, there's this rather undistinguished looking English sandwort, Arenaria norvegica subspecies Anglican, which again is only known from this part of Britain. It's a wonderful area for mosses and liverworts. And in August 1965, I was on a moss course with Michael Proctor at Malham, and drawing that 1 week, actually 6 days in the field, we saw 395 species. Some of them really beautiful, like the salmon pink Orthopecium rufescens, or shaded limestone rocks, or Rhytidium gosum, and this Encalypta alpina with these and made up these wonderful English names: alpine extinguisher moss. There it has this wonderful sort of shaped capsule. And this my wife and I found on Ingleborough in 1969, which was the first record in England. And on limestone walls near Pennygent, you can find Zygodon gracilis, the slender yoke moss. And this is amazing because the only localities in Britain are in the Craven Pennines, and otherwise it then occurs in Bavaria and in a few places in the Alps. So there's a lot of moss interest, but that's not what you've come to hear about. Well, now if we start to move to the north, the northern Pennines, up at Teesdale, on the junction of Cumberland, Westmoreland, Durham, the North Riding of Yorkshire, between about 300 and 600. And this is famous botanically, and it became famous through a miner, John Birks, and his friends, James Backhouse Sr., the father, and James Backhouse Jr. And I have to confess that they are my botanical heroes from the 19th century. And in the 1840s, 1850s, they found almost everything there is to find in Teesdale. So along the River Tees, you'll find the beautiful yellow shrubby cinquefoil, Davyrica, or used to be Potentilla fruticosa, and the other side, the so-called dolerite windsill, it's Falcon Clints. And in the days of Backhouse, in the 1860s, this locality was wonderful for rare ferns, but sadly they've all been collected out, and Falcon Clints is now nothing like what it must have been in Backhouse's day. And along the upper part of the Tees, erosion into the limestone material is given Setri Bank, which has a wonderful array of plants like bird's-eye primrose and the alpine Bartzia. This is Widdybank Fell, which is higher up, about 527 meters. This is what it was like in 1969, and it was the only British locality then, Teesdale Sandwort, Sabulina or Minuata stricta. Of course, this was the site of an intense conservation battle where ICI wanted to construct a reservoir, and there was a rather bitter feud between the conservationists and ICI. ICI got permission to build the reservoir. The reservoir is there, but ICI had never used a single cubic centimetre of water from the reservoir. A very sad story. And if we move south to Cronkley Fell, which consists of this rather amazing so-called sugar limestone. This is limestone that's been metamorphosed by other hot rocks and to extreme temperature, but it basically very, as you can see, rather shaly, rather sandy. And on Cronkley Fell, there's the hairy rock rose, Helianthema irlandicum, subspecies levigatum, which is endemic to Cronkley Fell. There's mountain avens, of course, and if you're in luck at the right time, you'll see the spring Gentiana verna. And now, this isn't in any way being critical of Gentiana verna in Teesdale. It's a wonderful plant to find, but this just shows you what it can look like in, for example, Switzerland. But I've never seen clumps as good as that in either Teesdale or in the Burren in Ireland, where it grows too. If you continue up Maze Beck, you come to Hike Up Nick, which is this amazing amphitheatre of dolerite sill. And if you're extremely brave and clamber down one of the gullies, you'll find alpine saxifrage, Micranthes or Saxifraga nivalis, which is its only locality out in England outside the Lake District and North Wales. And in the turf, there's small plants of the alpine forget-me. So it's a wonderful area. And then we'll now move from Teesdale, which is rather well known, to the northwest Pennines, Little and Great Dunfells, Knockallgill, Dufton Fell, Crosby. And these are challenging botanically and physically. And no offense to them, but they're rather remote and they're largely rather dull. You can find two rare grasses, alpine catsdale in its only English locality on Cross Fell, and the alpine foxtail, Alipicurus magellanicus. And you also find some very interesting mosses that only grow on animal dung, like Splatinum vasculosum with its amazing capsules. And this thing, which we only ever seen once, and this is actually called Aplodon von Scholii, and it's actually growing over a dead sheep. It only lasted there for about 10 years, and then, of course, everything decays, and the moss is now not been seen in England in recent years. But then, as you all know, there was the major outbreak of foot and mouth in 2001, a disaster for farmers and their stock, but it wasn't such a disaster for plants. And in 2010, Jeremy Roberts, of Viola Rupestris fame, wrote an article, The Flowery of Cross Fell, Montane Vegetation and Foot and Mouth. And in 2002, a year after the foot and mouth, Rod Corner from Selkirk, Jeremy Roberts and others were quoted, we were rewarded by a magnificent floral display, which is unlikely to be seen again for a considerable time. And what was so special about it? Well, in the days of the backhouses, they found about 30 localities for the marsh saxifrage, Saxifraga hirculus. It's an extremely rare plant in Britain. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, there were only about 5 known English localities. And then after the foot and mouth outbreak, it appeared in many places for just a few years, often growing with the hairy stonecrop, Sedum villosum. Now, the saxifrage grows in basic flushes and by springs that are neither not too acid or too calcareous. And they require some, but not too much grazing for long-term survival. So prior to foot and mouth, they were heavily grazed and not protected. And soon after the outbreak, it flowered well and was detected. But by 2010, it was difficult to find again as heavy grazing resumed. So if ungrazed for long periods, it can get smothered out by its competitors. So it really needs what we could call intermediate grazing. Now, much of the Northern Pennines over to the Cheviot, it's covered by blanket bog. And when you get to the Cheviot, the places like the Bizzle or the Henhole, they look very promising botanically, but actually I was rather disappointed with them. But over the blanket bogs, you find these wonderful plants like the interrupted club boss, Lycopodium anotinum, cloudberry, Rubus camimorus, dwarf cornel, Cornus suecica, and dwarf birch, Vetch lanana, and these called the so-called peat alpines. So we'll now move from the Pennines to the Lake District, the highest mountain, 978 meters. And the Lake District is rich in mountain plants, but by golly, you have to work hard to find them, and also to be good on very steep rocks and screens. And the great plant explorer, as well as the ornithologist and conservationist, was Derek Ratcliffe, and this is his official retirement photograph when he retired as chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy Council. He wasn't going to have a portrait taken of him in a sort of a suit and tie. This was his official photograph, climbing in fact to a sparrowhawk nest in Cumbria. And he wrote a magnificent paper, The Mountain Floor of Lakeland, which was published in the Proceedings of the Botanical Society of the British Isles, as it was then called. It's now the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. Now, the tough thing about the Lake District is that there's no single outstanding locality. Places like Wastwater, Helvellyn, Dovedale, Kentmere, they all have one or two specialities, but there's not one single place or nethermost coves going up to Helvellyn, or Red Tarn Helvellyn, Elgill in Langdale, or Tarn Crags Gully. They all got one or two really special things, but no one amazing place. So common mountain plants compared to Pennines are things like the parsley fern, which is really everywhere in screeds in Lakeland, and the Alchemilla alpina, the common alpine native. And other common plants you can find in many places are things like the mountain sorrel, Xeridygina, the starry saxifrage, Acranthes stellaris, and on more basic rock, the yellow saxifrage, Saxifrage. And in one or two places, you get occasional shrubs of Salix laponum, the downy willow. But the real special, the two rarities that are not easy to find are the alpine catchfly, now called Silene suecica, used to be called Lycnis alpina, and the Juga pyramidalis, the pyramidal bugle, that both of which just have single localities in the Lake District. So our final destination is North Wales, and it's in the same class as Lake District. Good flora, but very difficult to find, to get to. And the classic localities are places like Clogwyn Duardi, or these cliffs below Snowdon Summit and above Glaslyn. Now, the sorts of plants that with some effort, you would find are the forked spleenwort. It's firm, often on walls and natural rocks, Splenium septentrionale, and two other ferns, Woodsia alpina, the alpine woodsia, and this is only otherwise in Britain occurs in the Scottish Highlands, and its relative, the oblong Woodsia, Woodsia ilvensis, that occurs in the Lake District and a few places in Scotland and one or two places in North Wales, but has been heavily depleted by over-collecting in the Victorian era. Then you get two mouse ears, Cerastium migrescens and Cerastium alpinum. And again, you have to go to Scotland to see that. And then, surprisingly, North Wales, a colony of the tufted saxifrage, Saxifraga cexpitosa, that again is a high elevation plant in the Scottish Highlands. But the great North Wales speciality is the Snowdon lily, first found by Edward Hewitt. And this is the way it grows, growing out of moss cliffs. And it was only when I was on sabbatical leave, working in Ontario, I visited the Adirondack Mountains in New York State, and I was amazed to see proper large Lloydia ceratina. It's now been put in the genus Gahia, but it's the Snowdon lily, and is still in Britain. It is only in North Wales, and otherwise then it's quite common in the Alps, but we don't have it at all in Scandinavia. So the current status is that we have about 150 species of mountain plants. And if you use the recording system of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, with 10-kilometre grid squares, you can group them as widespread if they're more than 100 such grid squares, scarce between 16 and 100, and rare if they're in 1 to 15 such. So there are 73 widespread mountain plants, 38 scarce, 39 rare, and sadly 4 extinct. And the rare can be divided up into ones which are critically endangered, and the 3 of those, the Arabis alpina, which just has a single locality of sky, Homogyne alpina, 1 locality, and the oblong woodsia, at the moment has 8 known colonies. Vulnerable species, 22, and near threatened. But at an international level, the only UK mountain plant included at a European scale is Saxifrage reducens. And it was, I can picture my Jeremy Roberts, and the ones that are now extinct between about 1813 and 1900 were due to collecting, or more likely a loss of habitat and changes in land use. Now, thinking about their future, in the last 150 years, as we all know, COP conferences on atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane concentrations and global temperatures have and are increasing, as of atmospheric nitrogen. And so West Norwegian glaciers are retreating rapidly. This is the glacier Birks. This is photographs taken in 1990. And we ask, and you see it in 1995, are alpine plants responding to these changes? And will alpine plants be pushed off mountain tops? And that's almost the situation of it today. So what one needs to do is to repeat old botanical surveys. Now, the Jotunheim Mountains in central Norway were surveyed in 1930, 1931 by Ryder Jørgensen, and he made the most wonderful detailed notes. He also actually was and we discovered this when you start to repeat his survey, he was also, in fact, he ran for Norway in Olympics. He was an athlete as well. So we were able to relocate 400 of his localities in 1998. And so we could see how the flora had changed. And my former student, Kari Clanderwood, and I put all this together. So this gives you an idea of the Jotunheim landscape, extremely rugged. This is going up to Galhoppigan, the highest point, 2469 meters. And here what we show is these are the different mountains that Jørgensen visited. The squares are the numbers of species he found in 1930, 1991, and the triangles are what it was in 1998. So we see between 1600 and 1800 meters, a big increase in the number of species. Between 1800 and 2000 meters, some increase, but not so much. And at the very top, hardly any change at all. Now, what we discovered was some plants have extended their elevational, their altitudinal limits. So particularly the dwarf shrubs like blueberry, cowberry, blue heath, and Salix verponum. And also some grasses like viviparous sheep's fescue and wavy hergrass. So these are plants that have come up in the last 70 years, and they've come up about 200 to 300 meters in elevation. Some plants on the very top have declined in their abundance, but they're still there, like the tufted saxifrage, the alpine mouse ear, the Arctic fleabane, which isn't in, it's in Britain, and a glacial buttercup that's not in Britain today. And they've declined either because of direct or more likely because of increased competition from the faster growing species expanding from lower elevations. So there's now very good evidence from a variety of surveys, comparisons of analyses in the 1900s, 1950s, and more recently in Europe and North America, that firstly, summit floras are becoming richer, things are moving up, but there's very little evidence for local extinction of high elevation alpines or submarine species. So why is that? Now you see Ben Lawes in Perthshire, which 1,214 meters, it's the richest mountain of alpines, and these occur on the cliffs all the way up to the summit. This has been well monitored by the National Trust of Scotland over the last 40 years. And what their surveys show is that the high alpines have shifted their lower limit up by only about 5 or 15 meters, but there's no change in their upper limit. In other words, they're getting slightly squeezed up, and these include the wonderful grouping saxifrage, Saxiparga ternua. So why is there at the moment so little evidence for local extinction of high elevation species? Well, what we need to do is to try to assess the alpine landscape, not at the scale of climate modelers, or even at the scale of a 2-meter height of a standard weather station, but at the level the plant grows. And of course, if you've been on any mountain or mountain summit, you know there's micro habitat differentiation. There are ridges, hollows, late snow, rock outcrops, screens, and so on. So using a technique called thermal imagery, Christian Kerner in Basel then used these to measure land surface temperature. So here is such a thermal imagery picture across the tree line. So here's the forest limit. This is in the Central Alps. And you see, surprisingly, this is the temperature, that it's colder in the forest than it is in the alpine grassland. But of course, it decreases as you go with higher and higher elevation. And this is, of course, because the trees shade the soil, so it stays cooler than it does in the grassland. But it's the absolute opposite to what one would expect. And so for this slope in the Thurka Pass in Switzerland, this is the thermal imagery picture, and you see what an enormous variety of temperature there is. And basically, you've got all this variation in slope, rock. This is geodiversity, and geodiversity leads to biodiversity. So in 2 alpine areas in Switzerland, Christian Kerner and his students did infrared thermometry, and they had little temperature recorders, so-called data loggers, to assess the variation in plant surface and ground temperature for 889 plots. And what they showed was just on those 2 mountain summits, the range of the growing mean soil temperature was 7.2 degrees. The surface temperature had a range of 10.5, and the growing season, greater than 32 days. So these are greatly exceed what the IPCC predictions are for the future, but just on one single summit. And so it warns against projections of alpine plants responding to climate warming based on very broad scale. And so, in fact, alpine habitats, alpine terrain is really, in many ways, a safer place to live under conditions of climate change than flat terrain, which offers no short distance escape from the new thermal regime. So landscape local heterogeneity leads to local climate heterogeneity, which gives some biological resilience, as it did in the past. And so here, this is a picture taken at midnight on the midnight sun on Mount Nolia in Nabisco in 1988. There's my wife. This evening light gives a very good idea of the microhabitats, the geodiversity there is on the mountain surface. And this concern about the threats to mountain plants was beautifully shown by work that Jeremy Roberts did at UK Scar, where he used GPS technology and Google Earth to map where all the populations of, in this case, mountain avens occurred. And this is its southernmost locality in Britain. And so he waymarked, these are all the populations using its GPS, imported these into Google Earth, and then overlaid onto an aerial photograph. So each dot is a population within a 10 by 10 meter grid cell in 2010. And this is the most remarkably valuable baseline for future monitoring here at the southernmost locality of Mountain Avens. So, conclusions. Although not as rich as the European Alps, North American Rockies, or Himalaya, the British mountain flora has its own charm. Beautiful, but also many rare and major challenges to find, especially in the Lake District. But new discoveries are still being found. Spring gentian has been found in places. Jeremy Roberts' violet, Deesdale violet, Saxifraga hercules, foot and now. Some sedges and grasses have also, and several mosses and liverworts. And also, we have to realize the flora is not static. We've seen the effect of the foot and mouth outbreak, increasing use of motorcycles and quad bikes, and increasing numbers of walkers along the Pennine Way, and the staggering numbers of visitors to North Wales and Lake District. We don't know what the long-term impacts of future climate change will be, probably some exterminations or even extinctions of endemics like poor Alchemilla minima, just stuck up on the summit of Pingleborough. If you're interested in mountain plants, the book that really got me going was this New Naturalist by John Raven and Max Walters in the New Naturalist series. There's also a book in the British Wildlife series, Mountain Flowers, but somehow, to me, it's just my age. I read this when I was a boy and got all fired up by it, and it's still, to me, one of the great books. And then Derek Ratcliffe wrote a masterly account of the mountain flora of Britain, published in British Wildlife. And then I've mentioned already Jeremy Roberts' Flowering Across Fell, Montane Vegetation. Now, I'd also just want to pay credit to Phil Abbott, who died last year. She was the plant recorder of Midwest Yorkshire, BC 64, from 1966 to 2018. And she published her magnum opus, Plant Atlas of Midwest Yorkshire. And I had the pleasure of botanizing with Phil in the Peloponnese, in northern Cyprus, and in the Swiss and Italian Maritime Alps, in the French and Italian Alps. And she always generously shared her unrivaled knowledge of Yorkshire plants with me from the early 1900s. So there are just endless acknowledgements. Ratcliffe, who really inspired us, and Michael Proctor, who again taught us so much about the Craven Pennines. Max Walters, who taught me plant taxonomy, and John Raven, authors of Mountain Flowers, Phil Abbott, and then Rod Corner, done so much wonderful work in the Northern Pennines, along with Jeremy Roberts and others. So I just end at that stage and say that it's a wonderful flora. Despite having been in the Himalaya and Patagonia and so on, I still get excited by British mountain plants. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And that excitement really comes through in your wonderful presentation. I'm always astonished at the diversity in botany, all the little niches that the plants find. And the fact that it's dynamic, whether it's due to climate change or browsing or just the change in the geodiversity was a new word I've learned this evening. So thank you for that. People are welcome to put questions in the Q&A, please, if you have any for John. First one, John, is around some of the technology advancements. You've mentioned the thermal imagery and GPS and satellites and so on. What's kind of up and coming at the moment that will help us to further that botanical study of these areas?
I think the sort of work that Jeremy Roberts did at Yukoga Scar, patient, walking with his GPS, recording in critical localities, like in this case, the southernmost English locality, Mountain Avens. Not much point in doing it in the center of range, but I think at the margins. And it's difficult to see how one can at the moment with current technology better what, for example, Kerner's done with his thermal imagery. So I think there's no substitute for this detailed field work. See, Jeremy Roberts, that's for 2010. Well, it's just crying out to go and get revisited, say in 2025 or something like that. And, you know, I'm appalled because I did my PhD on the Isle of Skye. You know, that was in 1969, and now it's sufficiently old that it's worth resurveying. It will be very different, of course. The Forestry Commission is planted exotic conifers over much of Skye.
Thank you. I'll keep going. There are a few questions, and I'm just putting Rick on notice that I'll ask Rick to sum up in a moment and do a vote of thanks. And I'm just looking at his face to see that he doesn't go, "Oh my word, I didn't think I was going to do that." I'm sure you can carry that in a moment, Rick. Thank you. A further question, John, about you mentioned pink and yellow mountain pansy. Question, I think. The yellow form is seen around the dales. Where can we see the pink form, and why the difference in forms?
Well, as far as I know, there's been no satisfactory explanation. Certainly the yellow one, as a schoolboy, I would see most of all in the Derbyshire Dales, which I could easily get to. The purple one I didn't actually see until I went to Scotland. So there are geographic patterns. I know Donald Piggott, when he was at Sheffield, tried to look into their ecological differences, and I don't think he ever found any satisfactory explanation. And then in places like the Ten Shan Mountains and in the Caucasus, you get different violas, but you can get almost a huge range of colour from almost white through to deep purple. So it's very odd. I'm sorry, I have no explanation.
No, that's almost reassuring, John. I was starting to think you know everything about everything, so you're mortal at least.
Well,
always more study to do, I take that as. Here's a question about the recent spring weather we've had, where we've had long, dry spring periods. Notwithstanding the geodiversity that you mentioned, do you think if that trend were to continue, we'll see a change in the distribution of alpines on British limestone?
I would expect there would be changes at the local scale. But because we don't tend to work at this local scale, the scale at which plants live, it would certainly not do the marsh saxifrage, Saxifraga hercules, any good. Continuous dry. And certainly already in the case of some mosses, things are are becoming rarer than they were.
Thank you. And the last one for the moment, unless any others pop in at the last moment, is about the concept of intermediate grazing that you mentioned, that some plants, you know, too much or too little, they would struggle with. How can that be introduced as a change in agricultural practice? Just an easy question to finish with.
Well, way back in the 1960s, the Nature Conservancy Council at the Moorhouse Nature Reserve, they put up some enclosures to keep sheep out. And the idea of this was to protect marsh saxifrage. And to their total surprise, it just basically declined more and more in the absence of grazing. So it's a very, very difficult one, this. Obviously, probably in the days of the back houses, 1850, 1860, there wasn't anything like the sheep pressure that was on the British uplands today. And so they perhaps saw the marsh saxifrage in its heyday. And then that just was repeated the year after foot and mouth. So I don't know, you know, it's a problem for the conservationists to try to find a way of having this intermediate type of grazing. But certainly overgrazing doing anybody any good. And lack of grazing is not very good for many of these plants either. So it's a very, very difficult
Agreed.
one. Yeah.
Thank you, John. That's all the questions. Before I hand to Rick, let me just remind everybody that next week's talk, because we're into a run of 3 talks in a row now, is Anne Riley with the 3rd installment of her wonderful Nature of Lockdown. So that's next Tuesday, the 1st of March at 7:30. I'm looking forward to that one as well. So over to Rick, please. Would you just sum up and thank John for his work?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks so much, John. I think that was everything as expected and hoped for. Starting in 1963, it's just about 60 years, I guess, of research, observations, developing understanding of our mountain plants. As always, impressed by that early enthusiasm and discovery of pollen as a schoolboy in lake glacial sediments, and wondering where the species that the pollen represented are at the present time, and then explaining how we can use paleoecological techniques to look at the history of individual species, mountain plants, and extending that to the question of what happens when the climate warms, and where did those species that are found in lake glacial sediments, what happened to them? And clearly some went extinct, but interestingly, quite a few remained in refugia, and that helps to explain some of our present distributions. And in the present distribution, starting again in the Yorkshire area with those early observations and studies of Arctic alpines in the Pennygent and Ingleby regions, and impressed that you've got all your old slides available and managed to scan them in, and the scans look really good. So those old slides that you took were really high quality at that time. And then moving around northern England up into Upper Teesdale, the most famous Upper Teesdale flora, absolutely stunning pictures, amazing range of species there. And then that's that story I've forgotten all about the Cowgreen Reservoir in 1990, an enormous amount of water that destroyed a lot of habitat and not been used. Except I think in one of the droughts when it was used to supply Yorkshire down, water in one of the droughts. Some wonderful pictures, memorable pictures, not just of flowers, but of people like Derek Ratcliffe up a tree. That was absolutely famous photograph, and that should be there for the record. And then coming to the future, I think question on everybody's in everybody's minds about what happens to an alpine flora. You simply expect these floras to disappear as the climate warms and these Arctic alpine species disappear off the tops of mountains. But reality is much more complex than that. The interesting observation by using old records to show that some of the Arctic alpine species, their lower elevation ranges have risen, but there's very little extinction at the mountain tops, and curious as to why that might be. And clearly from that research of making comparisons with past records, being able to show that there's a whole range of microhabitats and mountain tops. And in fact, it's a little bit like the refuges again. There's these microhabitats, shaded areas, which allow a range of temperatures to occur that allow these Arctic alpine species to survive. So this is a habitat with some resilience. So I think that was an optimistic note to hand on. So thanks again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Rick, for that. And thanks also to Hilary for being on standby in case of connection problems with John. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.